CMD speaker for the spring, Cybelle Fox. We're really happy to have her. Cybelle just graduated from Harvard 5 years ago. It's amazing what she's produced. Unfortunately, she went to Harvard and not to Princeton, but we won't hold it against her. She's already in 5 years, she's produced 2 American Journal of Sociology articles in a book. This is the cover of the book, 3 Worlds of Relief, which is just amazing research. And even though she went to Harvard, she gets what's happening in the West on the kinds of issues that she's talking about. And I thought she got it because she was from San Diego, but I just found out she's from Canada. But she did go to UC San Diego. So I'll let you talk. But anyways, thank you for coming.
Thank you very much for having me here. It's a real pleasure and an honor to share my work with you. Now, over the last decade and a half, there's been a flurry of legislative activity designed to restrict non-citizens' access to social assistance. California's Proposition 187 in 1994 barred unauthorized immigrants from access to most non-emergency social service providers. While it was struck down by the courts before it was ever implemented, since then several states have passed similar initiatives. Proposition 187's most enduring legacy, however, probably came in 1996. That year, as part of its overhaul of welfare, the federal government placed a 5-year bar on most recent legal immigrants' access to social welfare programs, among other restrictive measures. Now, opponents of these restrictive policies have argued that the federal restrictions in 1996 were unprecedented and that they denoted the emergence of a new nativism that was distinct from the old for its emphasis on immigrants' consumption of public benefits and because it blatantly targeted Mexican immigrants in particular. State-level restrictions on unauthorized immigrants, they claim, were redundant because unauthorized immigrants supposedly never had access to these programs. Others, however, disagree, claiming that these exclusions represent nothing more than simple cost considerations or perhaps a continuation of America's historic unwillingness to extend social welfare benefits to non-citizens. Now, these debates led me to wonder exactly how did immigrants fare historically, right? After all, the modern welfare state was born on the heels of what had been the largest surge in immigration in American history. Between 1890 and 1920, 20 million immigrants arrived on American shores. Like today, they represented roughly 12% of the population. Did these immigrants, many of them from Europe and Mexico, make their way to social assistance when they arrived? Were they entitled to assistance in the midst of the Great Depression? How important was citizenship and legal status for access to New Deal programs and the nascent welfare state? Now, when I began my search for answers to these questions, I found that there was little published information on the subject. There's a vast literature on race and welfare, but it focuses overwhelmingly on blacks and whites. It demonstrates that racial divisions have profoundly influenced the size, character, and scope of the American welfare state. But this literature has virtually nothing to say about immigrants, at least historically. Now, despite this, many Americans certainly have a lot of assumptions about how the way things used to be. They like to tell themselves that unlike their ancestors, immigrants today are making use of too many social welfare programs. So in the run-up to welfare reform, Representative Bill Archer said, "My ancestors and most of our ancestors came to this country not with their hands out for welfare checks." Similarly, a Buffalo News reader wrote, "Our ancestors came here legally and did not place great demands on government services." National polls suggest that these attitudes are indeed widespread in the United States. And I wanted to see whether the lore stood up to the reality. And the results of those efforts are my book, 3 Worlds of Relief. 3 Worlds of Relief recounts the untold story of the politics of race and immigration in the development of the American social welfare system from the Progressive Era to the New Deal. In it, I compare the incorporation of blacks, Mexicans, and European immigrants and then into the social welfare system, and then I examine the influence of race and immigration on the scope, form, and function of social welfare provision across the North, South, and the Southwest. By comparing across group, I wanted to tease apart the relative influence of race from citizenship and legal status for access to assistance. This isn't working all of a sudden. Let's see if this can- Okay. There we go. Now, the conclusions in my book are drawn from a mix of quantitative analyses and archival research. So I rely heavily on the integrated public use microdata census data, the ICWMS data, various national public opinion polls. Gallup started polling in the mid-1930s, and an original data set of local relief spending in almost 300 cities. I also did archival analysis. I looked at congressional hearings and debates. I analyzed 50 years of proceedings from the National Conference of Social Work. I looked at annual reports from state and local welfare agencies from across the country. I did analysis of contemporary journals, newspapers, and popular magazines. And then I did a lot of archival work in national, state, and local archives. And these are some of the archives that I visited in the course of the many years that I was working on this book project. Now, the book demonstrates that Blacks, Mexicans, and European immigrants were treated quite differently by the Progressive Era relief system and the New Deal welfare state. European immigrants were largely included within the contours of social citizenship. Blacks were largely excluded, while Mexicans straddled the boundaries of social citizenship precariously until relief officials forced them out from the boundaries of social citizenship and the nation. So inclusion, exclusion, and expulsion. Now, this characterization is based on my analysis of about a dozen different outcomes, but I'm going to focus on only a few today. The first area that I want to look at is local relief spending. So prior to the Great Depression, relief provision was funded mostly at the local level with a mix of public and private relief agencies. And I wanted to see whether race and immigration shaped the welfare systems that developed in areas where these groups tended to live. Now, up until now, social welfare scholars haven't really looked at differences in relief provision across cities, and that's because they haven't had the data to do so. But early in my research, I stumbled across this tiny little Census Bureau report that looked at local and private relief spending. And the data is for the first quarter of 1929. Using this report, I created a data set of public and private outdoor relief spending for the largest 294 cities in the United States for that first quarter of 1929. So this is going to give us a sense of what the local relief system looked like right before the stock market crashed and right before the federal government got heavily involved in social welfare provision in the United States. Now this represents virtually all cities with a population of 30,000 or more. And it represents about 72% of all relief spending that was happening in the United States at the time. Now, outdoor relief includes money spent on food, on clothing, on shoes, on coal, burial services, and cash for poor individuals who live in their own homes as opposed to a poorhouse or an almshouse. By 1929, not very many people are living in those almshouses anymore. Now, what I found is that there's a significant amount of variation in relief spending across cities. So the bottom 10% of cities spend only 34 cents per capita on relief, and the top 10% of cities spend upwards of $2.95 per capita. Cities also differed significantly in the way they chose to fund relief. So 32 cities had no public relief provision whatsoever. 12 relied only on public sources and had no private relief provision, but the vast majority choose some sort of mix between the two. Now, funding sources matter a lot during this period because private relief officials were much more likely than their public counterparts to blame individuals for their poverty, to believe that people should be supervised while on the dole, and to think that people were essentially responsible for their own condition. So cities' choice to rely on private versus public relief can have a substantial effect on the treatment that poor individuals in that city would receive. I then matched this city-level spending data to 1930 census data on the racial and immigrant demographics of these cities to see whether there was a relationship between spending and funding and racial and immigrant context. And of course, I found there was. So a 10% increase in the Black or Mexican population was associated with a decrease in per capita relief spending by about 15 cents, and a 10% increase in the foreign-born white population is associated with a 22-cent increase in per capita relief spending. The excluded category here are native-born whites. Racial and immigrant context alone explains about a quarter of the variation in all of the spending going on in these cities at the time. What's more, I found that an increase in the Black or Mexican population was associated with a decrease in public funding of assistance, but an increase in the foreign-born population was associated with an increase in public funding for relief provision. And racial and immigrant context alone explains about 42% of the variation in the funding of these programs. Now, because of the racial and ethnic patterning of relief, Blacks, Mexicans, and European immigrants would have had different access to relief services based solely on their city of residence, let alone whether they had access to the services provided where they lived. Now, in addition to seeing how racial and immigrant demographics were related to spending and funding differences, I was also interested in the extent to which local relief agencies either cooperated with the Immigration Service to deport dependent Mexicans or used their own funds to repatriate those who could not be deported. Now, social welfare scholars haven't really thought very much about this outcome, but it's a critical part of the story. In part because I found that Southwestern relief agencies were much more likely than Northeastern and Midwestern ones to try to expel dependent individuals from the country. Now, to give you a sense of this variation, I'm going to talk briefly about two cities, Los Angeles and Chicago. These are both large cities with well-developed relief systems by the 1920s, and Los Angeles is home to a large Mexican population and Chicago to a large European immigrant population. Now, in Los Angeles, I found very close cooperation between relief and immigration officials. This was a conclusion shared by local and federal immigration officials, immigrant advocates, and local relief officials. So, for example, in 1925, the Los Angeles Department of Charities invited the Immigration Service to set up shop in the local welfare office in 4 days a week to interview aliens eligible for deportation. The department provided the Immigration Service with, quote, desk space, 2 stenographers to record and transcribe preliminary and warrant hearings, and an automobile to help him complete his investigations. Early in the Depression, the local relief committee also asked the Immigration Service to come to Los Angeles to conduct an immigration raid. Now, relief officials didn't think that the INS would actually be able to deport that many people through this raid, but by publicizing it in advance and insinuating in the press release that Mexicans would be targeted, they hoped that their efforts would, quote, scarehead large numbers of Mexicans to move south to the line. The INS acknowledged that, quote, the net effect of publicity and the insinuation that Mexicans would be targeted had led Mexicans to believe that they were not wanted in California and that all would be deported whether legally here or not. This is the INS's conclusion. Now, in addition to cooperating with the Immigration Service, Los Angeles relief officials also used their own money to repatriate Mexicans. They did this in part because the INS could only deport people who had actually violated immigration laws, but it didn't have the staff and funds to deport even all known violators. But more important, relief authorities wanted to get rid of Mexican Americans as well as Mexican immigrants. So an immigration inspector explained that Los Angeles relief officials, quote, anticipate not only the departure of many deportable aliens, as well as undeportable aliens, but also that many who are not aliens, but who are of Mexican extraction, will take advantage of the opportunity to enter Mexico under the conditions outlined, it being borne in mind that all of these classes are now receiving charity in this community. So, relief officials hired trains, like this one, and they coerced Mexicans into leaving the country. Now, all told, American relief officials repatriated somewhere between 30 and 40,000 Mexicans during the first few years of the Great Depression. Hundreds of thousands more, though, were either deported or left of their own due to the hostility that they experienced. Now, if Los Angeles has close cooperation with the Immigration Service, Chicago's on the other end of the spectrum. Chicago's immigration officer told federal relief officials in 1923 that he received little cooperation from Chicago relief agencies. Rather than try to find ways to deport dependent aliens, social workers there often intervened in individual deportation cases, and they hid destitute immigrants in private charities until they could no longer be deported. And while Los Angeles officials were sending telegrams to the INS to try to get them to come and conduct immigration raids, the Secretary of Labor said that Chicago had done little to assist in the national deportation drive in the early years of the Depression. So, to remedy this, in 1932, local immigration agents went to Cook County's welfare office, knocked on the door, and said, "We'd like to see your welfare rolls." Despite the fact that 20% of relief recipients in the city were non-citizens, which was a higher proportion than in Los Angeles, Cook County relief officials refused to give the immigration agents access. According to the director, quote, "It was the unanimous opinion of the County Welfare Committee that an examination of the people getting relief to find out whether they are deportable aliens would destroy faith in the community. If the government sent its agents around asking questions, the people would become suspicious and frightened. We do not believe that a general investigation by the government would accomplish enough from the economic standpoint to compensate for the harassment it would cause." Now, Chicago was probably somewhat more friendly towards immigrants than other cities, but even in New York, that did far more than Chicago to try to expel dependent aliens from the country, their efforts paled in comparison to what transpired in Los Angeles. So Los Angeles relief officials, in just 3 years, repatriated more aliens, or expelled more dependent aliens from the country than the entire state of New York did in the 60 years between 1880 and 1940. Now, the last area that I want to highlight, the kind of last outcome, is the Social Security Act. Now, our modern welfare state came into being with the passage of the Social Security Act in 1935, which created social insurance programs like Social Security and unemployment insurance, and then means-tested public assistance programs like aid to dependent children, old age assistance, and aid to the blind. Now, the traditional way that social welfare scholars tell this story is that because of occupational restrictions barring agricultural and domestic workers from the more generous social insurance programs, blacks were far less likely than whites to be covered by social insurance programs, and they were therefore relegated to the more demeaning means-tested assistance programs, which had few federal standards or protections. But this is only part of the story. Those same occupational exclusions also barred the vast majority of Mexicans from the most generous social insurance provisions, but the real winners here aren't just whites, but foreign-born whites in particular. Now, why were foreign-born whites more likely than anyone else to be covered? First, foreign-born whites, especially Southern and Eastern European immigrants, were more likely to work in those occupations covered under Social Security, especially manufacturing. Second, the Social Security Act contained no citizenship and no legal status restrictions. So both legal and illegal immigrants had a federal right to Social Security and unemployment insurance, and this was true from 1935 all the way up until the 1970s. To make sure that European immigrants understood this fact, a prominent immigrant advocacy organization put out a newsletter right after the Social Security Act passed, in which it assured its readers that the application forms for Social Security, quote, ask only a few simple questions: name, address, date, place of birth, color, and sex. They do not ask whether the applicant is a citizen or an alien, or if an alien, when or in what manner he or she entered the United States. They also told aliens that if they were nervous about this, they could file for Social Security under their American names, reducing the possibility that you could ever match immigration files with Social Security files. And to prevent even that possibility, the Secretary of Labor, Francis Perkins, specifically instructed immigration field officers to, quote, refrain from requesting information from the Social Security Board for immigration, naturalization, or other purposes. Now, European immigrants were not only more likely than native-born whites to work in occupations covered by Social Security and then eligible regardless of citizenship or legal status, they're also more likely to be nearing retirement when the program is first instituted. So the age structure of the population is such that many foreign-born whites were actually in their later working years when the Social Security program is first issuing checks. And the way Social Security was designed is that those workers nearing retirement had to only work for 3 quarters, after which they'd be eligible for a pension for the rest of their lives. Consequently, they ended up contributing very little to the system, but by design benefited almost as much as those who had contributed for their whole careers. So instead of insurance for retirees of European origin, Social Security was more akin to welfare, except without the means test and without the stigma. Inclusion, exclusion, expulsion. Now, why do we see these 3 different trajectories of incorporation? I think there are a lot of reasons why we might not have expected these sorts of differences. So each group contained many members who were desperately poor and reviled, and Blacks, Mexicans, and Southern and Eastern European immigrants each suffered from significant discrimination at the hands of native-born whites. Some historians, in fact, have argued that Southern and Eastern European immigrants were neither treated nor perceived as fully white when they first arrived on American shores. It was only after the U.S. closed its doors to mass migration in the 1920s, perhaps even as late as World War II, that the boundaries of whiteness began to expand to cover Italians, Poles, and Jews. Now, whether Southern and Eastern European immigrants were perceived as white or not, which is a point of debate in the literature and to which I'm going to return shortly, there are other reasons why these findings should puzzle us. Scholars like Alberto Alesina, Edward Glaser, and Bob Putnam, and others have argued that diversity, whether racial or ethnic, linguistic or religious, impedes redistribution. That's because diversity is said to decrease social solidarity, generosity, social trust, class consciousness, all factors that are presumed necessary for the development and maintenance of a generous welfare state. But if diversity is always so bad for redistribution, why would cities with more foreign-born whites spend more on relief than cities with more native-born whites? Moreover, why in the midst of a catastrophic economic collapse, when there's not enough relief for U.S. citizens, let alone aliens, would non-citizens be included in these New Deal programs at all? Now, given that immigration to the United States was curtailed heavily with the 1921 and 1924 Immigration Acts and then essentially halted at the start of the Depression in 1929, it might be tempting to assume that issues about the inclusion of non-citizens in the New Deal had just been rendered moot. But this was not at all the case. It was a matter of serious concern to policymakers, social workers, congressmen, the general public, and especially to non-citizens and their families. So there was rumors circulated in the press that there were over 1 million non-citizens on relief, and that FDR's administration refused to collect and share data on non-citizens' participation in New Deal programs. There was an intense debate about whether non-citizens should be included in welfare programs, and Congress and the White House were deluged with letters from an angry public. So Ohio senators, for example, got 15,000 postcards protesting giving WPA jobs to foreigners while American citizens went without. A Chicago resident also complained that, quote, the majority of foreigners think it's smart to get on relief, drive a car, have 2 or 3 others in the family working and live off of a big-hearted Uncle Sam. They should kick them all back to Europe, as the majority of them are absolutely no good. Now, given this backlash, federal officials speculated that nativism was actually much more intense in the middle of the Great Depression than it had been in the period that had spawned the immigration quotas of the 1920s. Now, both legal and illegal immigrants were targeted. This is a cartoon from the front page of the Chicago Tribune, the same year that the Social Security Act was passed. And the bottom row of the cartoon says, many idle aliens who entered this country illegally are on the dole, while American taxpayers must work to support them. Sound familiar?
Yes. Very familiar. Especially so if you're from Chicago.
Interestingly, and this really surprised me, nativist attitudes did not vary that much by region. These polls measure support for expelling dependent aliens from the country. This is from 36 and 38. And support is slightly higher in the Southwest than the North, but really only slightly, right? The vast majority of Americans did not believe that aliens should receive relief and that those who did should be expelled from the country. So, in order to understand why blacks, Mexicans, and European immigrants were treated so differently, I argue that it's useful to think of these groups as inhabiting separate worlds in the first third of the 20th century, each characterized by its own system of race and labor market relations and distinct political systems. From these worlds and each group's place within them, three separate perspectives emerged about each group's proclivity to use relief. The distinct political systems, race and labor market relations, and ideologies about each group's proclivity to use relief then influence the scope, reach, and character of the relief systems that developed across these communities. So I'm going to describe these worlds in a little detail. So first, it's important to note that in 1930, 90% of European immigrants lived in the North, 69% of blacks lived in the South, and 87% of Mexicans lived in the Southwest. Immigrants from Europe typically settled, in particular, in the large industrial sections of the Northeast and Midwest, and they worked disproportionately in skilled and unskilled manufacturing jobs. Blacks and Mexicans lived disproportionately in rural areas, and they also worked disproportionately in agriculture. But the regions in which blacks and Mexicans lived were governed by starkly different systems of farm labor relations. So the relationship between black tenants and white landlords in the South was shaped both by debt peonage and ethos of paternalism. Both of these practices developed after emancipation as a way for planters to retain their labor force. So paternalistic landlords, at least in theory, provided non-monetary assistance, housing, garden plots, medical care, intercession with legal authorities, to loyal and productive workers who displayed the appropriate measure of deference. However, paternalism was far less prevalent in the West. So Mexicans were more often migrant laborers, unattached to any single employer, and therefore largely outside the system of debt peonage and paternalistic relations. Blacks, Mexicans, and European immigrants also occupied different positions in America's racial and color hierarchy. So blacks were unambiguously non-white and deemed racially inferior and inestimable and subject to exclusion and segregation. Southern and Eastern European immigrants were seen as racially distinct from and inferior to Northern and Western European immigrants. But however racially inferior they were deemed to be, I argue that Southern and Eastern Europeans were still treated by most American institutions, including the courts, the census, the political parties, unions, schools, settlement houses, and social workers as white. Race and color were not synonyms at the turn of the 20th century, so you could be both racially inferior and to another white person and white at the same time. So people thought about race in terms of the Italian race and the German race and the French race and the English race. And people who were of the Italian and Polish races were inferior to people of kind of the English and French races, but all of them were still white. To the extent that their racial fitness was questioned, many native-born whites thought that these deficiencies required the thorough assimilation of immigrants into American society. Now, Mexicans, by contrast, occupied a much more liminal position in America's racial and color hierarchy. Guaranteed many of the privileges of whiteness by law, for example, the right to naturalize, they nonetheless increasingly suffered many of the liabilities of non-whiteness in practice: separate accommodations, separate schools, separate neighborhoods among them. But the color line that they faced in the Southwest was not as invidious as the color line that blacks faced in the South. And this early liminal status and the growing hardening of opinion throughout this period that Mexicans were probably not really white and perhaps forever alien had important implications for their experience over this period. Now, finally, the political context also varied across these regions. So northeastern cities were often rife with machine politics and other institutions like settlement houses, unions, and schools that were bent on the political incorporation of European immigrants. Mexicans, however, were far less likely to live in machine cities or in areas with other institutions bent on their assimilation. Cities in the Southwest were much more likely to be run by Anglo-municipal reformers who worked to pass progressive structural reforms like nonpartisan and at-large elections, which were designed to kind of eliminate the evil influences of machine politics and especially the power of the immigrant vote. In the South, blacks were largely disenfranchised by poll taxes, literacy tests, and white primaries. Mass disenfranchisement led to one-party rule and the election of racially conservative Southern Democrats who did their best to maintain the racial, political, and economic status quo. Now, I argue that these three worlds had a direct influence on the scope, form, and function of relief provision during the Progressive Era and the New Deal. So, for example, Western grower and Southern planter interests influenced local welfare spending, but in very different ways. So paternalistic planters were reluctant to subsidize local relief because they saw it as a threat to their control of their labor supply. So one study of Alabama planters found that, quote, landlords are fearful of any governmental program, whether relief or rehabilitation, that promises to bring independence to sharecroppers because they fear that should that happen, that the tenant would escape from under their influence. By contrast, Western growers, right, who made few efforts to care for migrants between harvests, actually saw local relief as a subsidy to the agricultural industry, at least prior to the Great Depression, because it allowed a large pool of migrant laborers to remain nearby and at the ready between harvests. As such, these growers sometimes encouraged migratory laborers to get on relief between harvests. So one farmer explained, quote, why should they not become public charges? I'm paying my part of the taxes out there. I just as soon send a bunch of Mexicans to the county hospital or county tuberculosis farm as a bunch of white men. Now, as I'm going to show you in a minute, the planters and growers' different attitudes towards relief had a big impact on the politics of relief provision in the South and Southwest. Now, the political context also had a direct effect on the shape of local relief provision. So Anglo-municipal rule in the Southwest left Mexicans with virtually no political power. As a result, Southwestern politicians spent the better part of the 1920s and 1930s looking for ways to expel dependent Mexicans from the country. So in 1923, the California legislature passed a law requiring that the State Department of Institutions cooperate with the Immigration Service in, quote, arranging for the deportation of all alien public charges who were admitted to any state institution. The Los Angeles Board of Supervisors also helped to plan the immigration raids, and they authorized the funds for the repatriation trains. And in 1938, the California legislature and Governor Merriam, angered over the mounting costs of relief, sent a resolution to Congress to expel dependent aliens. This was one of many resolutions that they sent year after year. The governor explained that, quote, the problem of Mexican aliens in California has become a very serious one. It should be a matter of grave concern to every American citizen, wage earner, and taxpayer who's compelled to contribute to the mounting costs of supporting aliens on our relief rolls. It was hard to find a single politician in the entire state of California during this period who was willing to kind of publicly oppose these sorts of measures. On the other hand, because political machines and other institutions bent on the assimilation of European immigrants were more likely to be present in the Northeast and Midwest, European immigrants were far more likely than Mexicans to be naturalized and far more likely to participate in local elections. And as a result, politicians were much more responsive to their needs. So when the Immigration Service came to Cook County Welfare Bureau and asked to see the relief rolls, Mayor Sturmack backed the decision of the County Welfare Committee not to open the relief rolls to the Immigration Service. When California Congressman Henry Stubbs and his congressional colleagues asked his congressional colleagues to bar non-citizens from WPA jobs because he felt that Mexicans were overloading the system, Northeastern and Midwestern congressmen rose to the defense of the alien on the floor of congressmen. So for example, Congressman Vito Marcantonio, who at the time was a Republican from New York who represented a lot of Italians who had also failed to naturalize, objected to Stubbs' proposal because, quote, hundreds of thousands of immigrants would be deprived of the benefits of the bill. What would then happen? You cannot deport them. You have no right to. They're not cattle. I do not think we are acting in the spirit of Americans. All of our ancestors were aliens. Would you have wanted restrictions placed on your forefathers when they came to this country? My friends, these aliens are patriotic at heart. They love America. They want to build America. Give them a chance to live. Now, these racial, political, and labor market differences also had a strong indirect effect on local welfare, on access and on welfare state development through its influence on the attitudes of social workers. And in that term, I include relief officials, caseworkers, and reformers. Now, as the gatekeepers of relief, these social workers play a crucial role in this story. So regional political economies and racial regimes influence social workers' perceptions about each group's proclivity to become dependent on relief. Because planters opposed blacks' use of relief, and because social workers thought that they were incapable of assimilation, blacks had very little access to relief. They were excluded from most social welfare services during the Progressive era, and so they were relegated to underfunded, segregated charities prior to the New Deal. And because of their exclusion, social workers came to see blacks as the group least likely to depend on relief, a belief that they rationalized on negative stereotypes, cultural and biological grounds. So a National Charity Society official argued that, quote, at the South as at the North, the colored race is not a begging race. They seldom apply to strangers for alms except in case of death in the family. And this view was widespread across the country among relief providers. Social workers, though, saw Mexicans in a very different light. Because growers were content to let them use relief between harvests, and because social workers initially were cautiously optimistic that they might be able to assimilate, Mexicans had much more access to relief in the Progressive era than did blacks. But that access came at a heavy price. As social workers started to grow pessimistic about the prospect of Mexican assimilation, they also came to believe that Mexicans were lazy, thriftless, and disproportionately dependent on relief. So the Los Angeles Charities Department observed in 1927 that Mexicans, quote, come to the United States in destitute condition. Their families are large in number, and many of the members syphilitic or tuberculous. The grade of intelligence is low and complicated by language difficulties. Although they have no intention of becoming citizens and cannot be persuaded to return to Mexico, they early learn to demand aid from the public funds. Desertion, jail sentences, illness, illegitimacy, and unemployment are the sources of poor citizenship among these immigrants. Social workers began to frame Mexicans' use of relief as an illegitimate burden on American taxpayers and a subsidy to the agricultural industry. So as one social worker explained, quote, the employer pays for cheap labor, but he does not pay for the Mexican. The citizenry pays the real expense of Mexican immigration in the form of public hospitals, nurses, physicians, charity assistants, jails, and retarded children. Social workers then went about exaggerating Mexicans' use of relief. They lobbied for their exclusion from the country, and they worked with immigration officials and politicians to deport those who sought assistance. Now, though the public and eugenists often saw Southern and Eastern European immigrants as welfare dependent too, social workers firmly rejected these characterizations, partly because they thought of the new immigrants as white, because these new immigrants had high rates of naturalization, because they worked in jobs that promised some measure of social mobility. These social workers were convinced that these immigrants were capable of assimilation. And so they did not frame European immigrants' use of relief as an illegitimate burden. Rather, they framed it as kind of a natural humanitarian response, perhaps even necessary for their full Americanization in the country. So a Buffalo charity official in 1911 wrote that while, quote, the proportion of Poles exceeds all others in the city poor office, all they needed was the attention of the social service community that had so far ignored them. They are thrifty, they are clean, they are willing, and they are neglected. They are raw material of the first value, undeveloped and wasting. Social workers then lobbied against immigration restriction from Europe, especially from Southern and Eastern Europe. They selectively cited data to make European immigrants look less dependent on relief than they actually were. In fact, they had greater access to these programs than did Mexicans. They lobbied against citizenship restrictions for assistance, and they protected destitute European immigrants from immigration agents. Now, with the rest of my time, I'm going to return to that relief spending example to show you how the three worlds influence the scope of relief provision in communities with more Blacks, Mexicans, and European immigrants. So remember, cities with more Blacks and Mexicans spend less, cities with more European immigrants spend more, cities with more Blacks and Mexicans are more privately funded, cities with more foreign-born whites are more publicly funded, and the excluded group here are native-born whites. And I argue that the three-world perspective helps to explain these outcomes. So in particular, the political economies of the different regions helps to explain why cities with more Blacks spent so little, and cities with more European immigrants spent so much. So paternalism ends up playing a huge role in this story, at least for the total spending measure. While differences in political context, especially differences in political culture and party preference, help to explain a lot of the funding choices between cities with more Blacks and cities with more European immigrants. But these differences in political economies don't explain why cities with more Mexicans spent so little and why they were more privately funded. Remember, growers in the Southwest are fine with having Mexicans get on relief between harvests, at least prior to the Depression. And for their part, municipal reformers aren't against all social welfare spending. Sometimes they teamed up with progressive social reformers to actually develop more robust relief systems. Low public spending in cities with more Mexicans has more to do with relief officials' resentment against Mexicans' use of relief than anything else. So to model these dynamics, I built two models where the dependent variables are real per capita outdoor relief spending and the fraction of total relief funds from public sources. Some of my independent variables are measured at the local level and some at the state level, and so I used a random effects model with robust standard errors. Now, some of you may have been wondering all along whether the reason why cities with more European immigrants spend more is because those cities were more urbanized, maybe there was greater need, or maybe there were differences in fiscal capacity, right? Maybe these big northeastern and midwestern cities where European immigrants lived were more likely to develop large public relief systems because there are returns to scale in big cities, or because it's really cold, and coal is an important part of the relief budget. Or maybe because those cities are richer than many of the cities elsewhere. So we have to control for all these things as much as we can with the data available. The data that are more central to my analysis include measures of racial and immigrant context, especially percent Black, percent Mexican, percent foreign-born white. Measures of political context, including voter turnout, the fraction of the foreign-born in the state ineligible to vote because they're non-citizens, the share of the population who voted for the Progressive Party candidate in 1924, an index of reform government, whether a city is run by a dominant political machine, and then a measure of state political culture. Finally, I include measures for labor market context, including the percent of the labor force in agriculture and manufacturing, and then the percent of farm wages paid in perquisites, which is my measure of paternalism, which I borrowed from a couple of economists. So this is the total per capita relief spending model. And I start with a model that includes all of the controls. And we can see that even after controlling for urbanization, need, and fiscal capacity, cities with more Blacks and Mexicans spend less, cities with more European immigrants spend more. Then I add political context, and then lastly I add labor market context. And in the final analysis, I find that, like I said, particularly important in explaining the variation in spending between cities with more Blacks and more European immigrants is the amount of paternalism. So cities and states with the lowest levels of paternalism spent upwards of $2 more per capita than cities in states with the highest levels of paternalism. The only thing that labor and political context fails to explain is Mexican racial context, which is consistent, I argue, with my racial resentment theory. And the qualitative data support this. So you see time and again examples of local relief officials pulling back their support of local relief spending in response to their resentment. So in 1929, for example, a Los Angeles relief official said that the burden on the taxpayers from the Mexican dependency problem had been so great that his department had recently decided to abandon all efforts at constructive casework, offering instead only the most temporary assistance and stressing immediate employment at all times. Now, here's the same sort of analysis, except the dependent variable is the fraction of funds that come from the public sector. Even after including the controls, cities with more blacks and Mexicans are more privately funded, cities with more European immigrants are more publicly funded. Here, political context actually does most of the work. So, and helps to explain why cities with more blacks were more privately funded and cities with more European immigrants were more publicly funded. Adding labor market context to the mix doesn't really affect things so much. But again, we haven't been able to explain the Mexican racial context story, and I argue that, again, that's consistent with my racial resentment story. And again, the qualitative data bear this out. So you see time and again in cities, when local officials start to get frustrated with Mexicans' use of relief, that they ask private agencies to start taking over the care of these groups. So public relief officials in Calexico, California, feeling, quote, very much burdened with Mexican charity, asked the local Mexican consul to care for their own dependents. And as a result, the Mexican Blue Cross became very active taking care of their own people. Okay, so to summarize, despite persistent and widespread nativism, European immigrants were included within the boundaries of social citizenship, while blacks were largely excluded. Mexicans were left on the periphery, granted limited inclusion at times, completely excluded at other times, and in some instances expelled from the country entirely. Now, the different treatment of blacks, European immigrants, and Mexicans reflected the worlds each group inhabited, worlds bound by both regional political economies and each group's racial position. Now, it's hard to do justice to a whole book in 45 or 50 minutes, but I hope that I'd at least convinced you that the black-white frame in the early welfare state literature vastly oversimplifies the politics of racial divisions in redistribution. For one, before blacks were ever strongly associated with welfare, Mexicans were. For another, it's not just the fraction of blacks in a community that influences welfare state size and scope. The fraction of Mexicans and European immigrants did as well. But my findings also suggest that the means through which racial divisions affect the politics of welfare may be different for different groups at different times. So we should be very wary about any sorts of claims about an unmediated or universal trade-off between diversity and redistribution. Right? Race or diversity matters, there's no doubt about that, but the ways in which it matters are historically contingent, and they're mediated by a variety of different social, political, and economic institutions. Now, I came up with a three worlds approach because I felt like it was important not to think about racial, political, and labor market contexts as kind of independent, mutually exclusive variables. I thought it made more sense to think about them as whole systems. Previous authors oftentimes tried to pit these against one another, so it's either race or politics or race or class that matters. And my own regression notwithstanding, that's not representative of the whole book, what I think is most important is how these things actually work together. Racial attitudes about Mexicans, for example, are not simply a reflection of their use of relief or even their place in the racial hierarchy. They're also products of the unique political economy of the Southwest, and it's impossible to understand how Mexicans came to be stereotyped as the most dependent group during this period without understanding those dynamics. Lastly, I think there are lessons here for debates about contemporary restriction. First, there is in some sense nothing new about the so-called new nativism, right? There's long been a focus on immigrants' use of public services, and public opinion has long been hostile towards immigrants' inclusion in welfare state programs. But nevertheless, despite this rampant nativism and catastrophic economic conditions, few NATO programs had any citizenship or legal status restrictions, and European immigrants managed to escape the full brunt of restriction whenever or wherever it existed. So we should be very wary about romanticized notions of the bootstrapping white ethnic who got ahead without assistance, right? Despite what some of us like to tell ourselves about our ancestors. European immigrants had broad access to social welfare assistance, largely without regard to their citizenship or legal status. Mexicans were never so lucky. I will end here.
Wow.
questions that came to my mind. One is, I wonder, I was thinking about this counterfactuals, right? I wonder how, Chicago got both Europeans and also Mexicans, right? So I wonder,
So did Los
I'm
Angeles.
so I wonder how
LA had all
they,
three too.
Yeah.
how they does the welfare officials in those places treated Mexicans? Were they treated differently, or not? And also how were non-Mexicans treated in LA? For example, how were European immigrants treated in those places? To try to get some kind of sense about whether it was a story of place or race. My second question had to do with if on your data you have any sense of variation of treatment of Mexicans by place where they moved to. For example, if the story is about political factors of how much access do immigrants have to political participation, I would expect a place like New Mexico, where Hispanics had a strong political participation, to be much more willing to provide resources to these migrants. So.
Great questions. So I'll start with the second one first. New Mexico had very few people living in the state. It did not even have a city with more than 30,000 residents in the entire state of New Mexico at the time. And it was also incredibly poor. So it doesn't end up in my data analysis in terms of the cities, because it didn't have any large enough cities to be included there. But because it was so poor, it didn't have any relief services whatsoever. So there's not much of an effect there. But there are very few Mexicans, in terms of kind of how this affected the broader Mexican experience. There's not much of an effect, because the vast majority either lived in Texas or 80% lived in Texas or California during this period. But there's no relief system that's developed at all. It's a very rural area. But I think that more has to do with the fact that it's not urbanized at all.
No immigrants either.
And there are no immigrants either. The first question, kind of how much of this is about region and how much of this is about race? And I spend a lot of time in the book trying to tease these things apart, and I find that both of those things matter. So if you're a European immigrant and you're living in Los Angeles, when the Los Angeles Charities Department decides to invite the Immigration Service in, you're likely to be caught up in the net at the same time. But Los Angeles, when it starts devoting funds to repatriation, paying for the repatriation programs themselves, they're not targeting European immigrants at all. They're only targeting Mexicans. If you're in Chicago, Chicago's slightly different than some of the other cities. I mean, in part I picked these two cities, but I realized in the process of my analysis that they represent really kind of polar extremes of treatment, and sometimes they're not entirely representative of what's going on in the region. So Chicago is sometimes a little bit more friendly towards all immigrants and even Mexicans than some of the surrounding communities. But what you find in the Northeast and Midwest is that many Northeastern and Midwestern cities, apart from Chicago, start repatriating Mexicans as well, and not European immigrants. And it's not because of cost. They thought in terms of cost effectiveness, both would save money. But Detroit, St. Paul, Gary, Indiana, a variety of different places start their own targeted Mexican repatriation program. So there's both a region effect going on, but there's also a race effect.
I don't know if you tease out the data by gender, but were Mexican women repatriated at the same rate?
That's a good question, and I don't know the answer to that. What I can say, and I don't pay a ton of attention to gender in this book, and that's a valid critique. It's not because I don't think gender is an important part of the story, although it didn't jump out at me in the same way that I was expecting it to, given the attention to it in the welfare state literature. But I'm starting to work on a paper now about Social Security and how these differences vary by not just race and citizenship or race and immigration status, but also by gender. And this is really, I'm just starting to think about this, so I don't really know what to make of it. But if you look at people who are in the labor force, so we're not looking yet at people who are out of the labor force, but if you look at people in the labor force, you find some kind of striking things. So first of all, foreign-born white women and native-born white women are, if they're in the labor force, they're just as likely to be working in those occupations that are covered. In the case of native-born white women, even a little bit more than their white male counterparts. If you compare Mexican women to Mexican men, they're doing better in terms of working in those covered occupations, although not nearly as well as whites. But black women are especially likely, if they're in the labor force, not to be covered by Social Security because they're overwhelmingly working in these domestic occupations. If you use the same kind, this is 1940 census data, they also had data on who has been issued a Social Security number. This would include both people who are working in the wrong occupations, but are also not in the labor force. So this is not just looking at people in the labor force, this is anyone between the ages of 18 and 64 who has a Social Security number. So you see that women are much less likely than men to have been issued a Social Security number. But for these women, in particular, it's because they're not in the labor force. For black women, they're much more likely to be in the labor force than any of these other groups. But then when they're in the labor force, they are more likely to be excluded. So I'm still trying to, so there's a gender story here to tell. I'm still trying to tease out all the effects. But black women end up.
I wanted to see if women were doing 40 years ago better in terms of institutional connections than men, because that's what I see in my research now. And
In
I don't
terms
know
of
how far
repatriation?
it goes, yes.
I mean, a lot of the repatriations were targeting entire families. So in particular, they did not want to repatriate just the male head of household and leave the women and children behind because they were worried that the women and children would be dependent on relief. So in terms of repatriation, and sometimes it's, the men have been deported and then they want to repatriate the rest of the family in particular. But I don't have exact statistics on how many are repatriated. I don't know that those exist by gender.
Could you talk a little bit more about the decision in 1935 to cover certain occupations by social insurance and to exclude others? So, what are the factions that caused that led to that decision?
So this is a point of big debate within the social welfare literature between folks who want to say that it's entirely because of Southern congressmen who wanted to go out of their way to exclude blacks from any social welfare programs, and others who argue that no, it actually came from within FDR's administration, that Morgenthau, the Secretary of the Treasury, I believe, that he came up with this idea initially because he felt like it was going to be too complicated to kind of track down the people who were working in these kind of casual jobs and the like and cover them early on. So it's not that he didn't want to cover them, but he wanted to kind of phase that in later. There was a lot of disagreement. I mean, there is evidence for both of these arguments. And given that Southern congressmen went out of their way to make sure that blacks would not have access to means-tested assistance programs with federal protections, it seems that had Morgenthau not suggested it, that the Southerners would have insisted upon it. So I don't think you can say that race is not part of the story, but this is part of a big debate. It should be noted, though, too, that we tend to think of this story very much in terms of Southerners, and they matter in particular because they tend to be heads of these committees. But some of these Southerners were Texans, and some of the people at the time said that it wasn't just about blacks, that other racial minorities, although they don't list them, were of concern to these congressmen, and they didn't want them to have access to these programs as well.
Can I ask you quick about native-born whites, migrant, but not immigrants, but migrants? The John Steinbeck image of the Dust Bowl victims from Oklahoma, Nebraska, who tried to go to California. They weren't going to LA, they were going to Central Valley to try to work in agriculture, and were met at the frontier, the border of, shot, stay out of our state, no less. And then the Farm Security Administration, the FSA, has set up kind of federal relief. It wasn't Somalia, but it was an American version of it. Tens of thousands of transients with nothing, just living outside. It's this huge federal intervention to clean. I think Harry Hopkins might have been in charge of it. I'm not sure which, the Brain Trust. But it's native-born, and they're definitely white. They're mostly of Irish, English ancestry from the Okies. You know.
No, that's it. Yeah, I talk about that.
They were in LA too.
Yeah, they were in
eventually,
LA
I guess
too.
they got down to Bakersfield,
Yeah.
Los Angeles, but they
Yeah,
didn't
there
know
were
that-
the bum blockades all, in
What?
Southern, they had the bum blockades in Southern California where the
Blockades.
sheriff's department was sent to the border to try to prevent people from entering. Sometimes those were also about excluding Mexicans, and the southern Colorado border, for example, was guarded, in particular trying to keep Mexicans out. So there was a lot of that
so was
going
it
on.
the California-Arizona border, the governor sent troops to the border.
Absolutely.
Like by Yuma,
Monkeys in-
Yuma, right
Yeah.
by where California.
Yuma
Yeah.
and out farther, the whole thing.
So I
That
talk
was
about
after
that.
they deported all the Mexicans.
It was after.
Maybe, well.
Had they already
Because
been
by then-
deported?
by
1935,
then,
they were all gone.
They're all, yeah, exactly.
No,
By
all
1935, most
Half
of
of
the
them were gone.
most of the repatriation has already happened. Certainly from the
Yeah,
welfare
maybe.
department's perspective, they've done most of their work. In part because actually the federal government comes in and says you can't discriminate against people on the basis of race or citizenship or any of these other things. That doesn't mean they stop completely discriminating, but that does serve as some sort of a check. No, so transients, that's a little part of the story I tell in the book, and that's an important part of the story. They do, in part, in kind of the way we thought about who should, this is what my next book is going to be about. Not entirely about transients, but it's about the rise of citizenship and legal status restrictions in the American welfare state from the New Deal to the present. And so because of the poor laws, the way they thought about who deserved assistance, while race is clearly very important throughout this whole period, you were entitled to assistance because you were a resident of the community, not because you were a member of the nation or how you entered the country. If you lived in Chicago for a certain number of months, you then became eligible for the assistance. And it didn't matter whether you were citizenship or legal status. So the poor laws are very much tied to kind of residence-based definitions of social citizenship, which is why transients get treated horribly during this period. And that shifts starting in the late 60s and early 1970s. And it's really in the Nixon administration that for the very first time you get legal status restrictions in all, federal legal status restrictions in all of the federal welfare programs, from Social Security, unemployment insurance, AFDC, not TANF, Medicaid, food stamps, unemployment insurance, all these programs get legal status requirements for the first time, and residence restrictions are abolished. So there's a huge shift in kind of the boundaries of social citizenship at that
That's all
point.
the federal level.
All at the federal level,
I mean,
yeah,
it's like on the federal civil rights, if you know.
right.
So in LA, you had, I mean, you talked about this in LA, but you talked about agricultural workers in LA. Now, they weren't all agricultural workers, of course, and maybe, I don't even know if most of them were, but this is LA County, right, so there's agriculture on the fringe. So were agricultural workers and industrial workers treated differently?
I don't actually see very much of a difference. So I'm not arguing that relief officials were parsing out who were the agricultural workers and who were not.
I mean, they might have been targeting agricultural.
They were targeting Mexicans as a whole group. They saw that, while there was a kind of a long-term resident population there, the population of Mexicans in Los Angeles swelled during the winter months between harvests. And that's part of what they got really frustrated about, is that a lot of those folks they claimed were trying to get relief
So were they
assistance
targeting-
in Los Angeles, but they were migrant workers who had been traveling, Texas into California and other places. So they would become dependent on relief in cities sometimes, and then go back out.
But so was there a geographical targeting? I mean, LA County is a huge place.
You,
Was there a geographical
In the
targeting?
area, because most of the LA County at the time was agricultural, although most people lived in the.
There was one LA County Charities department where a lot of this stuff was happening, and then there are a variety of private agencies around. But I don't think there are branches of the LA County. I didn't see any evidence of different branches of the LA County Charities Department in different parts of the city. There's just kind of one area that took care of the entire city. So I'm not arguing that kind of Mexicans who were industrial workers were treated better than by local relief officials. I argue that the general kind of labor, the fact that there were so many agricultural workers and the fact that Mexicans were disproportionately in these occupations led to these different ideas about relief dependency, and also led employers to have, the most important kind of employers in the state, to have very different incentives about whether to support relief provision or not. So one of the things that happens during this period is that as the federal government gets involved in the provision of relief, and they start providing much more generous relief, and they try to tell growers that you can't kick people off of relief once the fields need labor, that the growers all of a sudden in the Southwest start behaving a lot more like the Southern planters, because now it's not a subsidy to their industry. Now they see it as a threat to their labor supply, and they're worried that Mexicans are using relief in order to do union organizing. And so they start to infiltrate all of the relief agencies, whether local or at the state level, and they start to try to kick Mexicans off of relief during this period, and they're quite successful. In fact, the head of the California State Relief Agency, the first job he took after he stepped down was with the State Agricultural Committee. So they were totally in bed with each other, essentially.
Your story helps to explain the disappearance of a lot of Mexican communities from the American terrain. Before 1930, well, during the 1920s, Mexican immigration to the U.S. exploded, and there were huge Mexican communities all over the West. Kansas City, Topeka, Des Moines,
Yes.
Oklahoma City, Colorado Springs, Denver,
Midwest.
and Chicago, of course.
Yeah.
And when the deportations came, all those places got wiped out except Chicago.
Yeah.
And the only place Mexicans remained were in the traditional southwestern areas where there were a lot of natives that couldn't deport.
Absolutely.
But Chicago Mexican community persisted because they were treated in Chicago as another immigrant group and not black.
Yeah.
And so there were some deportations, but very few from Chicago. And so it persisted, and it formed the nucleus for what became the second largest Mexican settlement in the United States after LA, when immigration revived in the 60s and 70s and 80s.
Absolutely. There's no question
But if you
about
go to
that.
Kansas City, it's like Mexicans never existed.
Yeah.
Only now they're coming in again.
Yeah, and I argue that, kind of social worker is kind of what happened, when you look at the proceedings from the National Conference of Social Work over these years, when there's a bar on immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe or quotas set in the early 1920s, all of a sudden the big topic of conversation at the National Social Work Conference every 2 years is Mexicans. And so all of these California and Southwest Colorado in particular social workers go to these conferences and they start to spread these stereotypes that they have about Mexicans. And so these stereotypes spread in part through these professional networks, either at the conferences or also through the journals. But there's just an explosion of journal articles and talks at conferences about the Mexican dependency problem. It was a term that was coined by Los Angeles relief officials, which then helps to explain why all these communities in the Midwest started targeting these.
And as your data point out also, or imply, by 1935, all the European populations were heavily second generation and citizens and part of the New Deal voting coalition.
Yeah.
And since half of all Mexicans arrived in the United States between 1915 and 1930, they were overwhelmingly immigrant and not citizens.
Yeah, so that is definitely the case. Let's see if I can find this. This is the percentage of male immigrants. Women's naturalization is very much tied to their husbands because of a variety of laws during this period, so it makes more sense to look at men. The percentage of male immigrants who were naturalized in 1930, 80% of Northern and Western Europeans and 60% of Southern and Eastern Europeans. And that's not counting the fact that they also have big second generations, as Doug was saying. And Mexicans, only 9% were naturalized. Irene Blumrad and I are working on a paper to try to explain the differences in naturalization to see whether this is all about the fact that Mexicans just didn't have, came in relatively recently, or whether it has to do with other individual level characteristics like literacy or the like, or whether this is more about, or as well about regional context of reception in terms of having institutions that are trying to politically incorporate these groups, or kind of discrimination based on race. Because the 1930 census is the first and only census that categorizes most, but not all Mexicans, as racially Mexican. But some, about 4 or 5% of Mexicans who are non-citizens, are racially categorized as white. So we use that to estimate the effect of each of these variables on the probability of being naturalized. And just being non-white decreases your probability of naturalization by 16%, and living in the Southwest decreases your probability of naturalization by 8%, even if you take into consideration a whole bunch of individual level variables that might matter. So we argue that kind of these are the change in predicted probabilities of being naturalized when you start with no controls, 63% less likely versus 18% less likely for Southern and Eastern European immigrants. Controlling for those individual level variables, resources, skills, and motivations explains part of the gap, but not all of it. Non-white social status explains more, and the regional controls explain a lot more. We haven't explained all of it, but that's a big part of the story.
The naturalization percentage didn't really, among Mexicans didn't rise above 10% until 1990s.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah, there's just very little effort to include these groups, and also not a lot of, I mean, there was, I think, a lot of discrimination by naturalization officers,
Wrong eligible.
and a feeling that what's the use of, if you're going to be treated so horribly, and at the very least, if I keep my Mexican citizenship, I can go to the Mexican consul and get assistance for whatever discrimination that I'm feeling.
The big factors in the 90s were stripping away rights and privileges of non-citizens, whether they have papers or not, in the 1996 round of legislation.
Yeah.
And Mexico's recognition of dual nationality after that explodes.
Right.
And especially after the propositions of one.
Yep.
Right.
Are you saying after 1996 they're allowed dual nationality? That Mexicans
Yes.
received that, the law was changed in 96 for dual citizenship?
In the 90s.
Or the 90s,
Exact-
it
what
doesn't
was the
matter.
exact year, 90, 95, 96?
95, I want to say.
95?
Yeah.
I didn't know it was that late.
That you're not allowed to.
You are allowed to.
You are allowed to have dual
But you know
nationality.
the oath says that you have to renounce your all allegiance, foreign and domestic. I mean you have to.
But that doesn't mean the Mexican government has to refuse to give you a passport.
Yeah.
Other country. Israelis all have the same.
Yeah.
American Israelis carry 2 passports.
And is it a 10% approval rating for Mexican naturalization?
10%.
10% are naturalized. 10%.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, isn't that the? I mean, wouldn't you rather live in Mexico?
I'll be right.
You know, I mean, isn't the whole point about the Mexican migration pattern is that they only started to really naturalize because we put these ridiculous draconian restrictions
But
in
this
place?
is a period in which a lot of ridiculous draconian restrictions are in effect, but they're not naturalizing either. I mean, in part, naturalization probably, I mean, if they looked at this, at the situation of blacks in the United States at the time, they would have said naturalization is probably not going to buy me very much, right? They have citizenship, and yet their rights are constantly abrogated.
Wasn't Mexico virtually paradise until the 40s?
They had a major civil war that killed 1 million people
There you
between
go.
1910 and 1920.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's not paradise.
Yeah.
2 slides back, you had a very low percentage of Mexicans. Thank you. How many, have you entered into that occupations? What majority are farmers compared to the 3 groups?
Yeah, so in this particular regression we don't include that, but I have played around with whether this is about kind of being, in particular, migrant laborers, so it may be even harder to get naturalization because you're moving around. That doesn't change the story about, that explains a little bit more of the variation, but that doesn't change the story about the effect of non-white social status for the Southwest being important. These are the 2 factors that Irene Bloomerhead and I want to highlight of that story. Not that these individual level factors wouldn't matter.
In the 1930s, there were no numerical limitations on Mexican immigration in the United States. The Border Patrol hadn't even been founded until 1924. And so most of the Mexicans in the United States were present legally, and at best guilty of minor infractions.
Well,
And
a number
so
of
a lot
them.
of the people that were deported were actually deported without due process, who were legally present, and their native-born children who are American citizens who are not deportable under any circumstances were deported along with them.
Oh, absolutely, that happened. But another thing that happened is that in the repatriation, so one of the things that the relief agencies did is they lied to Mexicans, telling them, you know, we're offering you this, we're not going to give you relief. The only thing we'll offer you is this train ticket to Mexico, but don't worry, you can always come back. Well, what they did with their papers is they stamped the back of it Los Angeles Charities Department, which meant that they could never legally re-enter the country. So many people who had been there for 20 years, all of a sudden, once they found out that conditions were much worse in Mexico, because the Depression is worldwide, that they didn't have any legal recourse to come back in. So all of a sudden, if they did come back in, they were coming in as unauthorized workers.
One last question. Let me ask a quick last question. Then.
Yeah.
How much of the story about relief is affected by what the ethnic groups themselves did? Because if blacks and Mexicans didn't organize, I mean, that they would be able, you know, they're probably organizing a lot less and affecting what these social service agencies did in Europe.
How much of it was about organization. I mean, blacks organized a lot during this period because they were so excluded from the social welfare provision. They built their own parallel system of social welfare provision at this exact moment, which they started in the 1890s. And so as a result, this isn't exactly where you're going, but I'm going to take this opportunity. You actually have a non-trivial number of black social workers in the United States in 1930. And part of the reason that, I mean, white social workers share this perception that blacks were the group least likely to become dependent on relief, but they also allowed blacks to be the ones to talk about blacks at the National Social Welfare conferences. And they very much did not want to portray blacks as particularly welfare dependent, so they had stories about how kind of hardworking this group was. So they helped to frame they helped to frame the image of blacks as not particularly dependent on the dole at the time. Some other race includes every group, including Mexicans.
Except the 30 census, the 1930 census had Mexicans were basically 4 or more Mexicans were the only ones included, right?
First,
First
and
or
second,
children
first or second
generation.
generation.
If they declared them.
No,
Yeah,
30
the 30
in
census, those were the instructions to the
But
interviewer.
there was a Mexican race question.
Exactly, and the instructions to the interviewer were include only foreign people born in Mexico or their children.
But census enumerators disregarded that for 250,000 Mexicans that were I was able to estimate that with the census.
Alright.
250,000 people who were third plus generation actually get counted as racially Mexican.
Oh, you
So
have
they
that?
disregard the census instructions. Not uniformly, but they do. This is from the paper census, but you can also look at this with the IPMS data where they actually have a variable where they estimate the proportion of Hispanics in the United States as a whole. And you can also see with that data that there were essentially no social workers, and all the qualitative evidence suggests that there were essentially no Mexican social workers. They did not develop a parallel social relief system. And there are a few people, certainly, who are protesting the stereotype of Mexicans as especially dependent on relief, but many of them don't have any political or even power within the social worker community to reframe the debate. And it's part of the story is one where exclusion leads blacks to have more power within this very narrow realm to be able to frame how their group is viewed, whereas Mexicans, because they had that early access, didn't develop, and because they were relatively more newcomers in the group, and because the population was migratory, the mutual aid societies didn't really have very much money or support to be able to provide kind of alternative relief for that group. And so they can't help frame the debate.
Didn't I read in Generations of Exclusion that the main source of social relief for Mexicans was the Catholic Church, and that was controlled by a bunch of Irish priests who didn't have Mexicans, and so they never set up schools or programs for
Yeah,
Mexicans.
That's
that was
definitely the case.
that's David Lopez.
Yeah, and you see it very much in my work too. So the Catholic Charities in Los Angeles, while it does provide relief for Mexicans, provides relief budgets that are 10% lower than for whites, for Mexicans, and there's a whole lot of
Yeah,
negative.
50% of Italians in New York in the 30s and 40s, 50s, they went to Catholic schools. In LA, it was always about 10%.
But Mexicans.
Yeah, because of the Catholic Church. They didn't develop as many schools in Mexico. Anyways, thank you very much.
Conference of Social Work. I looked at annual reports from state and local welfare agencies from across the country. I did analysis of contemporary journals, newspapers, and popular magazines. And then I did a lot of archival work in national, state, and local archives. And these are some of the archives that I visited in the course of the many years that I was working on this book project. Now, the book demonstrates that blacks, Mexicans, and European immigrants were treated quite differently by the Progressive Era relief system and the New Deal welfare state. European immigrants were largely included within the contours of social citizenship. Blacks were largely excluded, while Mexicans straddled the boundaries of social citizenship precariously until relief officials forced them out from the boundaries of social citizenship and the nation. So inclusion, exclusion, and expulsion. Now, this characterization is based on my analysis of about a dozen different outcomes, but I'm going to focus on only a few today. The first area that I want to look at is local relief spending. So prior to the Great Depression, relief provision was funded mostly at the local level with a mix of public and private relief agencies. And I wanted to see whether race and immigration shaped the welfare systems that developed in areas where these groups tended to live. Now, up until now, social welfare scholars haven't really looked at differences in relief provision across cities, and that's because they haven't had the data to do so. But early in my research, I stumbled across this tiny little Census Bureau report that looked at local and private relief spending. And the data is for the first quarter of 1929. Using this report, I created a data set of public and private outdoor relief spending for the largest 294 cities in the United States for that first quarter of 1929. So this is going to give us a
CMD speaker for the spring, Cybelle Fox. We're really happy to have her. Cybelle just graduated from Harvard 5 years ago. It's amazing what she's produced. Unfortunately, she went to Harvard and not to Princeton, but we won't hold it against her. She's already in 5 years, she's produced 2 American Journal of Sociology articles in a book. This is the cover of the book, 3 Worlds of Relief, which is just amazing research. And even though she went to Harvard, she gets what's happening in the West on the kinds of issues that she's talking about. And I thought she got it because she was from San Diego, but I just found out she's from Canada. But she did go to UC San Diego. So I'll let you talk. But anyways, thank you for coming.
Thank you very much for having me here. It's a real pleasure and an honor to share my work with you. Now, over the last decade and a half, there's been a flurry of legislative activity designed to restrict non-citizens' access to social assistance. California's Proposition 187 in 1994 barred unauthorized immigrants from access to most non-emergency social service providers. While it was struck down by the courts before it was ever implemented, since then several states have passed similar initiatives. Proposition 187's most enduring legacy, however, probably came in 1996. That year, as part of its overhaul of welfare, the federal government placed a 5-year bar on most recent legal immigrants' access to social welfare programs, among other restrictive measures. Now, opponents of these restrictive policies have argued that the federal restrictions in 1996 were unprecedented, and that they denoted the emergence of a new nativism that was distinct from the old for its emphasis on immigrants' consumption of public benefits, and because it blatantly targeted Mexican immigrants in particular. State-level restrictions on unauthorized immigrants, they claim, were redundant because unauthorized immigrants supposedly never had access to these programs. Others, however, disagree, claiming that these exclusions represent nothing more than simple cost considerations, or perhaps a continuation of America's historic unwillingness to extend social welfare benefits to non-citizens. Now, these debates led me to wonder exactly how did immigrants fare historically, right? After all, the modern welfare state was born on the heels of what had been the largest surge in immigration in American history. Between 1890 and 1920, 20 million immigrants arrived on American shores. Like today, they represented roughly 12% of the population. Did these immigrants, many of them from Europe and Mexico, make their way to social assistance when they arrived? Were they entitled to assistance in the midst of the Great Depression? How important was citizenship and legal status for access to New Deal programs and the nascent welfare state? Now, when I began my search for answers to these questions, I found that there was little published information on the subject. There's a vast literature on race and welfare, but it focuses overwhelmingly on blacks and whites. It demonstrates that racial divisions have profoundly influenced the size, character, and scope of the American welfare state. But this literature has virtually nothing to say about immigrants, at least historically. Now, despite this, many Americans certainly have a lot of assumptions about how the way things used to be. They like to tell themselves that unlike their ancestors, immigrants today are making use of too many social welfare programs. Sense of what the local relief system looked like right before the stock market crashed and right before the federal government got heavily involved in social welfare provision in the United States. Now this represents virtually all cities with a population of 30,000 or more, and it represents about 72% of all relief spending that was happening in the United States at the time. Now, outdoor relief includes money spent on food, on clothing, on shoes, on coal, burial services, and cash for poor individuals who live in their own homes as opposed to a poorhouse or an almshouse. By 1929, not very many people are living in those almshouses anymore. Now what I found is that there's a significant amount of variation in relief spending across cities. So the bottom 10% of cities spend only 34 cents per capita on relief, and the top 10% of cities spend upwards of $2.95 per capita. Cities also differed significantly in the way they chose to fund relief. So 32 cities had no public relief provision whatsoever. 12 relied only on public sources and had no private relief provision, but the vast majority choose some sort of mix between the two. Now, funding sources matter a lot during this period because private relief officials were much more likely than their public counterparts to blame individuals for their poverty, to believe that people should be supervised while on the dole, and to think that people were essentially responsible for their own condition. So a city's choice to rely on private versus public relief can have a substantial effect on the treatment that poor individuals in that city would receive. I then matched this city-level spending data to 1930 census data on the racial and immigrant demographics of these cities to see whether there was a relationship between spending and funding. So in the run-up to welfare reform, Representative Bill Archer said, "My ancestors and most of our ancestors came to this country not with their hands out for welfare checks." Similarly, a Buffalo News reader wrote, "Our ancestors came here legally and did not place great demands on government services." National polls suggest that these attitudes are indeed widespread in the United States. And I wanted to see whether the lore stood up to the reality. And the results of those efforts are my book, 3 Worlds of Relief. 3 Worlds of Relief recounts the untold story of the politics of race and immigration in the development of the American social welfare system from the Progressive Era to the New Deal. In it, I compare the incorporation of Blacks, Mexicans, and European immigrants, and then into the social welfare system, and then I examine the influence of race and immigration on the scope, form, and function of social welfare provision across the North, South, and the Southwest. By comparing across group, I wanted to tease apart the relative influence of race from citizenship and a legal status for access to assistance. There we go. Now the conclusions in my book are drawn from a mix of quantitative analyses and archival research. So I rely heavily on the integrated public use microdata census data, the IPMS data, various national public opinion polls. Gallup started polling in the mid-1930s, and an original data set of local relief spending in almost 300 cities. I also did archival analysis. I looked at congressional hearings and debates. I analyzed 50 years of proceedings from the National